that there's something that, some family member disagrees with, or, family members don't get along. I mean, you can only do so much with that, but you can at least in most circumstances provide the structure that's necessary to actually, find easier ways to resolve those problems. So for those of you who just joined, I'm attorney Justin Randall with Hooper Law Office. Welcome to our chat on planning for up north and like family legacy property. We refer to it as up north, but it can really be anywhere, right? The joke in our office anyway is up north is not actually a direction. It's just wherever you have your family land or your family cottage, because everyone's always going up north to the cottage. But regardless of what type of family property it is, whether it's hunting land, farmland, cottages, lake property, whatever it is, the planning around them is somewhat similar in terms of the things you want to think about and the types of tools you might use to plan for these things. And there's a few different things that people try to do to plan for this that don't end up really working out. I mean, the most common thing you see is kind of people doing nothing and just passing it on without doing the planning in advance. And that can be sometimes that doesn't, people don't have an issue where a family member creates a problem, or there's bills that aren't being paid, or, whatever the dispute might be. But you're opening it up to that possibility without a structure to deal with it if you do nothing at all. So just to remind everybody, this is interactive, so you can submit questions on the Q&A function and I'll see those come up. I'll answer them as they come in as quickly as I can. Please feel free to send any of those in. It's helpful to be able to answer people's questions. The other thing to remember as well is that you'll be receiving at the end of this a feedback form, which actually gives you a place to let us know if you'd like to come in and talk to any of our attorneys. We go through a lot of things that, after somebody hears some of this information might say, oh, that's something I need to talk about, or my family hasn't done that planning, or maybe we've done planning that isn't working and we need to look at it again. So those initial consultations, if it is something you'd like to set up, are complimentary. They don't cost you anything to come in and talk to us. We schedule them for about 2 hours, but they can be less, or if you have someplace to be. I mean, that we just budget that amount of time for it. And usually by the end of those meetings, we can give you a pretty good idea of what we would recommend for you. So again, if it's something you'd like to do and come in and talk to us, just fill that out or reach out to us and set up a time to talk. But yeah, so that is something you'll receive at the end of this, as well as some materials on some of the things we're going to talk about. The document you'll receive is called Tools for Up North Planning. So it's it's a document that goes through a couple different things that people would try to do sort of as a grid, and it explains how those different types of plans actually function, right? Or what they're commonly used for. So to get started, really what we're talking about, like I said earlier, is not a specific type of up north property or a specific type of family legacy property. Sometimes that's referred to as. It could be land, it can be a farm, it can be hunting land. Maybe it's just the family home that you all return to every Christmas or Thanksgiving, right? It could be any number of things that you all share together. Hunting land right now is a big topic because it is getting into the hunting season, or it's already bow season, right? I can't take credit for knowing the starting dates of that. I every year have to be reminded of when that starts. So, but if it's something that's important to your family, it's something to plan for. The biggest problems that come up when people inherit those types of properties is there is no structure set up to deal with things. What I mean by that is it might be something where somebody just, transfer on death, deeded the property over to their kids, all however many there are, or they left it through their will or their trust or whatever their estate plan is. They left it to them just as multiple owners. So in this, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about with that is somebody who has 4 kids, a lot of times what they'll do if they're trying to make things as straightforward as possible on their end, they'll just leave it to them as 4 different owners. And it's easier to set up, that's true, but it doesn't account for a lot of problems that come up a lot with shared property. People don't often think far enough in advance when they're talking about, okay, how do we deal with X, Y, and Z if that comes up? So what I'm talking about there is if there's bills to pay, if there's property taxes, how are those shared? Is there an obligation for everyone to share in those? What happens if somebody doesn't take their fair share of it or can't for some reason due to, financial hardship, right? How does that get dealt with? In terms of hunting land, one that I would have not thought about because I'm personally not a hunter, but a hunter was explaining to me is you can't have so many people on the property hunting at the same time, right? So usage can be a really big problem if you have too many hunters, all with potentially dangerous firearms or bows, and they're not being aware of the other people on the property. That can lead to accidents. And so, is there a structure in place for how people get to pick the weekend they use, or how is there somebody keeping an eye on how many people are using the property at any given time? So that in particular for hunting land is just, that's a liability concern more than anything else, and a safety concern. So those are the types of things that you need to set up rules for in advance if you can, because then you're able to control a lot of what those rules are going to end up being. For example, if you own that property with your spouse, it's two people who have to agree on those rules at this point. If it's just you and your spouse, or if it's just you and just you own it, it's only you that has to set up the rules on that. It's much harder to get 4 different people or multiple other people to actually agree on all of those rules later. So setting up those rules prior to them inheriting it can be really helpful to them. And also then they can't be mad at each other for what those rules are because you're the one who set it up, which I understand nobody wants their kids to be mad at them. But believe me, from an estate planning perspective, it is much better for them to be upset with you, mom and dad, for setting up those rules than it is to be upset with each other, because that is less likely to create disputes for them down the road. So having a structure to pay bills, having a structure to deal with any sort of disagreements over usage, or having sort of like somebody in charge of scheduling the use of the property, right? Those are really important things to consider when you're passing on this property. Just passing it on without any of that in place opens it up to a lot of problems potentially. And, it's less so more a fact or a matter of, how do they get along today? Because yeah, they might get along perfectly fine today, but they're also not having those discussions today, right? A lot of times those discussions can create dispute where there might not have been otherwise. So you can kind of nip that in the bud by creating those rules in advance. So deeds, people will try to use transfer on death deeds a lot because transfer on death deeds do avoid probate. That part of it is true, but they don't provide for any sort of contingency planning at all, really. They leave it to the people on that transfer on death designation. But what happens if one of those beneficiaries has a disability that comes up that wasn't known about at the time, right? What happens if they're getting sued for some reason, or getting a divorce and it becomes, if they accidentally commingle it and it becomes marital property? A lot of those sorts of things can happen to people even when you're not anticipating it. So it's really important to think about, well, what would we want to happen in that circumstance? How do we want them to be protected for that? And how do we do that? And you're not supposed to know the answer to that. That's why people like me have a job. That's our job to think about those things and know how to protect people from those sorts of unforeseen circumstances that can come up. So deeds are a tool to use, certainly. We use them all the time, but they're a part of a bigger plan. They're not a plan by themselves for the most part. I can't think of a lot of reasons why a deed by itself would be better than using some other structure. The other biggest problem with a deed, transfer on death deed, if that's what someone's using to pass it on, is there's no liability protection on that, right? It's that that person might have insurance, right? Which you should have insurance over those sorts of things, property and all of that, but they don't provide any extra liability protection. So a big concern of mine when it's just land, for example, or a property, where no one really lives on it, but it's, commonly used, or, it's hard to keep track of all the people that are on it. A big concern of mine is liability. And, you can never stop anyone from ever suing you, right? In theory, anybody can sue anyone for any reason. It doesn't mean that they'll win. It just means that they can. And that can be a huge problem with like larger parcels of land where people are commonly using it. You don't always know if it's used by multiple, children of yours or friends of the family, you don't know who is going to always be on that property at the same time. So if somebody is doing something where they're creating a liability, doing something dangerous, how do you protect yourself from that? And that's where insurance is certainly helpful, but you can also use other structures as well to protect people. So one of the most common tools we would use to protect people from the liability of the land, for example, or of that property, would be a limited liability company, an LLC. You might even, I have a lot of clients who have like apps they use where they look at properties and look at parcels and can see the owners. And a lot of times when I bring this up, they say, oh yeah, that's probably why I've seen so many of these pieces of land owned by an LLC. And that's true. I mean, what an LLC is used for is really a couple of things that can help solve some of the problems I brought up a second ago. The first is that it actually protects not what's in the LLC from liability, but it protects the owners of that LLC from the liability of the land. So if you don't want someone getting hurt on that land being able to sue you for your own personal assets, in addition to the land, an LLC sort of sets up that wall. As long as it's managed properly, it sets up a wall between what's in it and what you personally own. So it's possible with an LLC even that somebody can potentially recover against the value of the property within that LLC, but it can cut it off at that point so that they can't come after anything else. Now, there are exceptions to that where people don't properly manage their LLCs or basically commingling assets between themselves and the LLC where it becomes indistinguishable. What that's called is when somebody pierces the veil of liability because liability protection, because they are not really using it properly. The law doesn't want somebody to just say it's owned by an LLC and then not actually treat it as such. That's not in what they would call public interest. So you have to actually manage the LLC properly. But as long as you're paying bills from the LLC, not from the person directly, or you're representing it as an LLC and sort of dealing with all of the management and bill pay and any sort of decisions that have to be made, if they're being dealt with through that LLC and everything's documented properly, that can provide a lot of protection for you as an owner of that LLC. The other huge benefit of an LLC is when you set up the operating agreement for that LLC is you can set up quite a bit of those rules that I was talking about earlier. So if you're looking at, okay, how do we deal with these sorts of disputes? How are we going to schedule the use of that property, or who is going to be in charge of those decisions? You can set those up in that operating agreement, and you should set those up in that operating agreement. And this is where I was saying it's much easier for you to do this now than it is to wait until the next generation inherits it. Even if you are that next generation where you already own it with your siblings, how do you pass that on to the next generation? Is it going to be 4 kids now and then 16 later, right? I mean, is that what is, are we going to have to deal with 16 people making those decisions? So with an operating agreement, all the owners of that LLC have to sign on to it. So it's much easier to do that sooner rather than later, because you can, the fewer the people on that deed or owning that property, the less you have to try to kind of all agree on the same thing. So doing it sooner than later is always beneficial, not just for the being able to actually get it done, but because the liability protection is really important. So one of the biggest things that people often misunderstand when they have an LLC is they think they have an operating agreement, but what they really have is they filed the LLC and they have what's called the Articles of Organization. That's not the same thing. So if you have basically a 1-page document and it says what the name is and who the manager is, and that's all that is, that's not an operating agreement. That's the Articles of Organization. And this is a really common misunderstanding. Really anybody can go file an LLC or create an LLC and get those Articles of Organization. I've had accountants do it. I've had individuals do it. Attorneys do it. I mean, anybody can do it. It's not really all that hard, honestly. What is really important though is that those people don't understand that there are still sets of rules that they have to follow in order for that liability protection to be in effect. But even though you don't have an operating agreement, those rules are listed in the state statutes. And, I can't speak for everybody, but my guess is most people with those have not read the statutes and understand what their obligations are in order to maintain the business or to, keep that liability protection going and make sure they're really operating it the way they're supposed to. The reason following those rules is so important is if you're not following the rules of your LLC or your business, you're not treating it properly. You're not setting it up in such a way where you're actually creating that liability protection. That's another way in the event of a lawsuit where somebody could try to pierce that veil of liability again. So the reason the operating agreement is so important for people to set up and know what it says and set it up the way it works for them is because then you're creating those rules. Those statutes are only, you can override those statutes with operating agreements unless it otherwise says so in the state statutes. Most of the LLC statutes say things like, unless it otherwise says in the operating agreement, here's the rules. So having you pick those rules makes it a lot easier for you to know what those rules actually are and follow it and tailor them to your personal experience and your personal needs. A really big reason this is important is families try to keep this property in the family a lot. And they don't want it to pass to someone outside of their immediate family, or each owner wants it to go to their kids, right? But the operating agreement, or excuse me, not the operating agreement, the state statutes don't have any rules about that. You can leave it to anybody you want if you're the owner, right? So it's really important, if that's the goal of the family, to restrict who can be an owner of this property in order to maintain that family connection. You need to say that in the operating agreement of who is even allowed to be an owner, who can they leave their interest to, how many people can they leave their interest to. If you're trying to, limit it from kind of exploding in ownership and having, 500 owners in 3 generations or whatever the math would end up being. So setting up those rules is really important. The other thing is dealing with disputes. LLCs, operating agreements, or the operating agreements of the LLCs, I should say, should have rules in there about what happens if there's a disagreement on something. How many people does it take to actually have a majority, right? Or a super majority, depending on how you're defining it. What happens if someone isn't paying their fair share of expenses? Does that impact the amount of ownership they have, or do they just get to have a free ride forever, right? In terms of, everyone else in the family is paying for the property taxes and this person hasn't paid in 20 years. There are tools you can use to say, okay, if so-and-so isn't paying their fair share, and it's, the family decides that that's become too much of a burden, there might be a way to potentially have that person not be an owner anymore because they haven't met their obligations. So there can be ways to deal with that. But just owning it outright is not, those structures don't exist. So that's the biggest reason to use an LLC, in addition to the liability protection, is making sure those rules exist where people can, have that set up. The reason you want to be able to deal with those disputes is because if these properties are meant to be like a family connection where you're keeping people together with the property, you don't want that property to ultimately be the reason they end up hating each other, right? You don't want them to drive them apart. If the goal is to keep people together, you don't want there to be a reason that they'll be driven apart by it. And having a structure to deal with disputes and lessens the likelihood of that happening. Again, I can't say that there won't ever be anything that will drive people apart. That people disagree for a lot of reasons on a lot of different things. It may not even be related to the property. It may be related to the property, but they just can't agree. You lessen the likelihood of that happening with those provisions in an operating agreement for an LLC that will deal with, tell people what they have to do. It's not up to them at that point. You set the rules. And if they want to change those rules, they have to agree at a certain percentage, right? Or maybe it's all of them have to agree. So it's much harder for them to change those rules then. So limited liability companies, LLCs, are one way to do that. I would not ever use a C corporation to pass on family property if that is the like your goal. If you're not operating a business and your goal is just to pass it on to the next generation, please don't put land in a C corporation. It's a terrible tax idea. C corps don't get that basis adjustment up to fair market value for the property within it when you pass away. Your stock in the property or in the C Corp would, but the property itself doesn't get that adjustment. So if they ever do have to sell that property for any reason, it's just not tax efficient. You still want to pass that land on to them in a way where they do get that basis adjustment at your death, so that they potentially, if they do have to sell it, it's not as much of a tax burden, or maybe not a tax burden at all. So C Corps are not effective tools for owning property that you're trying to pass on to the next generation, because it's not the best tax solution for that at all. The other planning tool we use quite a bit to pass these properties on, and we often use in conjunction with an LLC or some other sort of business entity, is a trust. When we're talking about passing this property on, a lot of times the big reason people don't want to just use a will for it is because they're trying to avoid probate. And if you're unfamiliar, wills only direct assets in the probate court. So if you're trying to pass land on outside of probate, that's why so many people talk about those transfer on death deeds, because it's a way to do that. But if you're trying to pass it on without the use of probate, but also do all of that planning I talked about and prepare for, the unforeseen circumstances, transfer on death deeds don't do that. That's where a trust would come in. So a trust, if it owns that property, it can pass it to the next generation without the use of probate, and it would pass it without the use of probate. But it can also put planning in there that says things like, okay, if one of these beneficiaries is subject to creditor claims, or if they are getting sued for some reason, or they're getting a divorce, or if they've passed before me, any of those sorts of things that can happen, here's how it's protected for them. So you can do that through a trust. And the benefit of a trust is that's not saying like an LLC is not protecting what's within it. You're protecting the owners of that LLC from the liability of the LLC. If you have people inherit through a trust document, you can also have them protected, or have the property within it protected, excuse me. So it's kind of think of it as a bit of the opposite direction of an LLC, right? You're now protecting the property from the liability of the person. And that's why they're not mutually exclusive. We often use both, because you can protect the rest of their inherited trust from the liability of the LLC, but you can also protect the LLC or from their own personal liability. So there's a lot of things you can do to sort of really cut down the risk for those owners, and provide the structure that still avoids probate for them. When it comes to this type of property, it is best to deal with the decisions now while you can. There's a story that really highlights kind of all of these issues that can come up, that we in our office refer to as, I think we refer to it as the cabin with a million owners. It wasn't really a million, but I think it was like 250. And what had happened for this family was that it didn't start out that way, obviously, but it had passed generation to generation to generation with no sort of plan on how many owners there could be, no sort of restrictions on that. So it doesn't take all that long, that many generations, I should say. I mean, still takes probably many years, but not that many generations to get to a lot of owners. I mean, if you have 4 kids and each of those 4 kids is 4 kids, I mean, it exponentially grows. And the issue with this particular property was that they didn't have a structure in place that limited who it could go to, or how many people it could be split amongst, or, could they only leave their share to one person, or could they leave to as many people as they wanted, right? And so it became so much of a burden just for them to even make any sort of bill decisions of, who pays what, how do we deal with this expense? If I remember the story correctly, they essentially had to have family, rather than a family vacation, a family reunion where they all got together, it essentially was like a family board meeting where they all had to decide every year on how this was going to be dealt with. And that's what that legacy of that property became then. Not, oh, this is a great place for the family to come back to, but, oh, we have to deal with this again this time this year, because now we got to figure out how to do, pay for this, or, whatever it is. And that could be avoided if you do the planning in advance, if you limit certain, things about ownership or who it can go to, and not just who it can go to, but maybe, do you want to think about limiting it to a certain number of people? And you don't always have to do that, by the way, but if that is your goal, if you're trying to pass it on generation after generation, it's something to think about at least. The problem in this example is that I don't think initially this was was not well planned out. So you can avoid a lot of those disputes up front. I hope what you guys take away from this more than anything else is that it's never too late to do this planning until the dispute comes up. If it's already passed on to you as the next generation, it's better for you to start doing that planning now than it is to just say, well, our parents didn't do it for us, so why do we even bother? Because the problem only grows over time. It doesn't get smaller. So you can only deal with the problem you have in front of you. But if you're in the situation where you are just the original owners of that property and you're thinking of passing it on, you can provide such a great benefit to the next generation and the one after that even. I mean, you can really be that legacy is that, okay, they did this planning, they did they set up the structure for us, they kept the family together, sort of that, I don't want to say like mythical figurehead of the family, but in some sense, people have that family member they think back to. I mean, everyone has that person in their family that maybe you've never met, but they all talk about like how nice of a person they were, or what kind of special of a relationship they had with them. And you can be that person in some ways when you do this planning, because you're really making sure that you're showing how much you care, honestly, is what it comes down to. Because it's one thing to leave somebody something, and that's not saying those people don't care about those people. They obviously do, but it is such a great act of caring and love to say, I made sure as much as I possibly could that this wouldn't cause problems for you either, that you have the effective tools to deal with it. So I guess with that, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll let you guys go enjoy the rest of your day. So coming up here, I believe, Nicole, if you want to remind me of what our upcoming dates are.
Yes, November 10th, we've got the veterans, so special planning options for veterans. And the week after, we will be having a live in-person opportunity to see the Wills versus Trust seminar here in Appleton.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, she is the helpful person on my shoulder sometimes when she comes up with those dates, because I try to remember. I'm not always that great. So please feel free to join us next week if you want to talk about or hear us talk about VA planning. There's some long-term care benefits for veterans that we can we plan around a lot. We're all VA accredited in our office. And then after that, like Nicole mentioned, we'll be doing our in-person seminar. And I believe that is in Appleton, if that's right. This one would be in Appleton. So we rotate the location every month. If that's something you're interested in, please feel free to sign up for that. I know space is limited in because we do it at the Fox Valley Tech at the Bordini Center here. And they are limiting capacity still, I believe. So if it's something you're interested in, we'll be talking about wills versus trusts. So our sort of overarching estate planning topic. If you want to sign up at estateplanninglive.com, that is a way you can sign up for that. And again, just one final reminder, if anything we talked about today makes you want to come in and talk to one of us, please feel free to fill out that feedback form and set up an initial consultation. Again, those are complimentary. They don't cost you anything. So please feel free to come in. Otherwise, I guess I'm still not seeing any questions, so I'll let you guys go. But thanks for listening to me and joining us this week, and hopefully